Picture this. You're at a high society European dinner party in the 1600s. The host, a man of great wealth and prestige, brings out the main course with a grand flourish. But instead of a roasted wild boar or a majestic peacock, it's something far more macabre. The centerpiece is not an animal, but a dark, crumbly substance sprinkled over the dishes. As the guests begin to eat, the conversation flows and the wine is poured, and you realize you are partaking in a bizarre delicacy, ground-up human remains. Yes, you heard that right. For centuries, Europeans didn't just collect mummies, they consumed them. Real ancient Egyptian mummies, ground into a powder, were served as medicine, baked into bread, and even featured at luxurious banquets. The practice was known as mummy medicine, or mumia. It was a medical craze that swept across the continent, turning sacred Egyptian artifacts into a hot commodity. But why? Was it some twisted ritual, a bizarre status symbol, or did they genuinely believe that consuming millennia-old corpses could bring them health and vitality? The answer, as with most historical oddities, is a strange mix of all three, with a heavy dose of misunderstanding. To truly grasp this bizarre phenomenon, we need to rewind to the 1500s. Europe was in the throes of the Renaissance, a period of rebirth and discovery where everything from art to science was being re-examined. Explorers returned from distant lands with tales that stretched the imagination. Yet nothing, and I mean nothing, captured the European imagination quite like ancient Egypt. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the mysterious hieroglyphs, these were not just ruins. They were symbols of a long-lost, powerful civilization. To the European elite, a piece of ancient Egypt was the ultimate flex. If you were anyone who wanted to be someone, you needed Egyptian artifacts in your collection. Statues, sarcophagi, and especially mummies. These were more than just preserved bodies. They were exotic trophies, conversation starters at fashionable soirees, and, most bizarrely, potential miracle cures. The trade routes that once carried silk and spices from the East were now shipping entire preserved human bodies across the Mediterranean. Mummies became so sought after that merchants would display them in their shop windows like luxury items, a grim juxtaposition of the sacred and the mundane. Imagine walking down a bustling street in London or Paris and seeing an ancient corpse propped up next to fine silks and exotic spices. This obsession wasn't a passing fad. European nobility would host elaborate unwrapping parties where they'd invite their friends to witness the macabre spectacle of unwinding a mummy. Guests would gather, sipping wine and exchanging witty remarks, as layers of ancient linen were peeled away, one by one, to reveal the preserved person inside. It was a spectacle, an act of consumption that started long before the remains were ever ingested. These were not just collector's items gathering dust on shelves. They were the very substance of a culture gone mad. The most shocking part is that these mummies weren't just collector's items gathering dust in rich people's cabinets. They had a far more practical and gruesome purpose. Across Europe, apothecaries, the pharmacists of the day, would stock mummy parts right alongside their common herbs and medicines. A patient with a stomach ailment might be prescribed a tincture of ginger, while a nobleman with a cough could receive a powder of human bone. Even artists got in on the action, using a pigment called mummy brown, made from actual ground-up mummies. This macabre paint color, with its rich, warm tones, can still be seen in the works of masters from the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood to lesser-known artists of the period. The irony is lost on no one. An ancient person's remains were used to paint the portraits of the living. Even the legendary playwright Shakespeare mentioned mummy as a medicine in his works, a testament to how commonplace the practice was. In Macbeth, the witches brew a potion that includes mummy, maw, and gulf of the ravened salt sea shark, a line that would have been instantly recognizable to his audience. This wasn't some underground black market fad. This was mainstream European culture at its finest, a deeply integrated part of medical and artistic life. But here's where things get truly bizarre. These ancient remains weren't just exotic curiosities anymore. Europeans had much bigger plans for them. They were about to turn sacred Egyptian artifacts into something you'd find in a medieval medicine cabinet. And trust me, how they came to this conclusion is even more shocking. So, how exactly did someone wake up one day and think, you know what would make a great medicine? Ground-up mummies. Well, it all started with a massive misunderstanding about a substance called bitumen. This black, tar-like natural substance was widely used in ancient Arabic medicine. Ancient Arabic medical texts praised the healing properties of bitumen, which they called mumia, a word that, confusingly, was also used to describe preserved bodies. Here's the wild part. Because some Egyptian mummies appeared dark and shiny, Europeans mistakenly thought they were preserved with this magical healing bitumen. This single critical error, a lost-in-translation moment that spanned continents and centuries, formed the foundation of the entire mummy medicine industry. Hold up! It gets even better. These European doctors came up with an absolutely bonkers theory called sympathetic medicine. The basic idea was that dead, preserved tissue could somehow transfer its preservation powers to living tissue. In their minds, consuming mummy bits was like taking an immortality pill. After all, these mummies had lasted thousands of years, right? Clearly, they knew something about preserving human flesh. This belief, while scientifically absurd to us today, made perfect sense within the intellectual framework of the time. The idea that a substance's appearance or origin could influence its medicinal properties was a cornerstone of medieval and Renaissance medical thought. A golden herb might be good for jaundice, a red one for blood ailments. So why not believe that a perfectly preserved body could impart its preservation to the sick? And we're not talking about some back-alley quack medicine here. The biggest names in European medicine were all about that mummy life. The personal physician of Francis I of France prescribed mummy powder. King Charles II of England had his own personal recipe for King's Drops, a concoction that included human skull and mummy extract. Even the famous philosopher Francis Bacon praised mummy medicine as a cure-all, noting its use for internal bleeding and bruises. This was a practice endorsed by the intellectual and medical elite, not just the gullible masses. It was a respected, common, and widely accepted form of treatment. So what exactly did they think mummies could cure? Pretty much everything. The list of ailments reads like a medical encyclopedia of the period. Headaches, bruises, broken bones, nausea, epilepsy, internal bleeding, and even the dreaded plague. Name an affliction, and a doctor had a mummy prescription for it. They would mix mummy powder into tinctures, pack it into pills, dissolve it in liquids, and even make plasters to put on open wounds. Some doctors even prescribed mummy wine. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Wine with dissolved mummy bits, a testament to how far they were willing to go to use this miracle substance. The most mind-blowing part? This wasn't some short-lived fad. The practice of using mummy as medicine went on for centuries. Medical textbooks from the 12th all the way to the 18th century regularly included mummy preparations in their prescriptions. The remedies were so commonplace that you could walk into pretty much any European pharmacy and ask for prepared mummy like you'd ask for aspirin today. The long reign of this bizarre medical practice speaks to the deeply ingrained beliefs of the time and the desperate search for cures in an age when disease was rampant and life was short. But here's the kicker, the tragic punchline to this whole macabre story. Remember how this all started with a mix-up about bitumen? Well, actual ancient Egyptians didn't even use bitumen in their mummification process. They used natron salt and plant resins. So Europeans spent centuries eating mummies because they misunderstood a single Arabic word. It's a jaw-dropping example of a lost-in-translation moment on a global scale, where a single linguistic error led to the desecration and consumption of thousands of human remains. When demand for mummy medicine exploded across Europe, it created one of history's weirdest and most gruesome supply chains. Egyptian tombs became the new gold mines. Teams of grave robbers, known as ghouls in some local accounts, would raid burial sites, sometimes bringing out dozens of mummies in a single night. These were not just a few scattered bodies. This was a mass-scale industry. The robbers would sell them to merchants who'd pack them onto ships bound for European ports like livestock. These merchants weren't exactly careful with their precious cargo either. They'd often break mummies into smaller pieces to fit more into their shipping crates. Think of it like ancient Egyptian Tetris, but way, way more disturbing. Here's where things get really dark. As demand for mummy medicine kept growing, suppliers couldn't dig up ancient mummies fast enough. The pressure to meet the insatiable European market led to a chilling innovation: the creation of fake mummies. Grave robbers and merchants got creative, turning to recently deceased bodies to fill their orders. They would take corpses from hospitals, orphanages, or execution grounds, treat them with bitumen and exotic spices to make them look appropriately ancient, wrap them up in old rags, and presto, a fresh mummy ready for the market. This gruesome deception highlights not only the lack of ethical oversight, but also the sheer desperation of the trade. Consumers in London, Paris, and Amsterdam were eating what they believed to be a miracle cure from ancient Egypt, but were very likely consuming the remains of a recently deceased criminal or pauper from their own continent. The mummy market had something for everyone. For the incredibly wealthy, you could buy an entire mummy to display in your home as the ultimate conversation piece. For the middle-class customers, a local apothecary might sell small pieces of mummy or a pre-ground powder. Some of the more enterprising merchants even set up mummy grinding stations right in their shops. A customer could walk in, choose their mummy, watch it get ground up fresh, and take it home. This was a custom product, a testament to the belief in the healing power of the mummy and the deep pockets of the buyer. And just like any luxury market, there were different grades of product. Top-shelf mummies were supposedly from ancient Egyptian royalty, a claim that, a spoiler alert, was rarely, if ever, true. Mid-range options might be labeled as priest class or noble mummies. Budget shoppers could get common mummy powder, which, let's be honest, was probably just regular corpse dust with some exotic spices mixed in to give it an authentic scent. The whole trade was so profitable that by the 1600s, Egypt was practically running out of mummies. The scale of this operation is staggering. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of ancient bodies were dug up and shipped off to be consumed by Europeans. It makes you wonder how many priceless archaeological treasures were lost forever, ending up in someone's medicine cabinet or a painter's palette. Just when you thought this story couldn't get any weirder, enter the mummy banquets. Yes, you heard that right. Actual dinner parties where the main attraction was eating mummies. You don't learn this in history classes out there. Picture this. It's 1680s France. You're at a high society gathering. The host is showing off their wealth and worldliness by serving mummy meat. Guests are passing around plates of flesh that's been carefully extracted from Egyptian remains, seasoned and prepared like some kind of ancient delicacy. They're washing it down with wine mixed with mummy powder, snacking on bread baked with ground mummy, and even sweetening their drinks with mummy-infused sugar. It was a grotesque culinary experience like a macabre farm-to-table movement, except the farm was a tomb and the table was set with thousand-year-old human remains. But the aristocracy didn't stop at eating mummies. They got creative with their morbid fascination. Some would host mummy painting parties, where artists would use that infamous mummy brown pigment to paint portraits of the guests. It was a twisted form of artistic expression, a way to immortalize a fleeting moment using the very substance of a long-dead person. Others would organize mummy unwrapping ceremonies, turning the desecration of ancient remains into a fashionable social event. They would gather in grand salons, toasting to the morbid curiosity that drove them, as if they were watching a show at the opera. The really mind-bending part is that these weren't considered shocking or taboo practices at the time. European nobility saw mummies as exotic commodities, not as human remains. They would casually discuss the best ways to prepare mummy meat, like they were trading cooking tips for a new kind of game. Some hosts would even brag about the vintage of their mummy, claiming it came from an ancient pharaoh or a priest. The practice became so extreme that by the mid-1700s, some European doctors were prescribing specific cuts of mummy for different ailments, a horrifying reflection of their belief in sympathetic medicine. They claimed the head was best for headaches, the heart for cardiac issues, and the feet for foot problems. Rich patients could special order these specific parts, while common folks had to make do with generic mummy powder. But if this practice was so widespread and endorsed by the medical elite, what finally made Europeans stop? Well, it wasn't a sudden light bulb moment. It was more like a slow, dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, eating ancient human remains wasn't the best medical practice. The first crack in mummy medicine's reputation came from an unlikely source: the tomb raiders themselves. By the 1700s, some started admitting that most of their ancient Egyptian mummies were actually homemade fakes. Nothing kills a luxury market quite like finding out you've been eating recently deceased criminals instead of ancient pharaohs. This revelation created widespread doubt, not just about the source of the mummies, but about the legitimacy of the entire practice. The idea that you might be consuming a common pauper rather than a king was enough to turn the stomachs of even the most devout believers. Then came the age of scientific thinking. The Enlightenment encouraged a more rational, evidence-based approach to medicine. Doctors started doing crazy things like actually testing if medicines worked. They began questioning traditional remedies that had been accepted for centuries without a second thought. And wouldn't you know it? There wasn't much evidence that eating ground-up mummies cured anything, except maybe an appetite. The scientific method, so revolutionary for its time, slowly but surely chipped away at the foundation of this bizarre belief. But the real death blow to the mummy-eating trend came from a growing interest in actual Egyptian history. As scholars started studying hieroglyphs and learning about ancient Egyptian culture, they made a shocking discovery. These mummies were people, like actual people, with names and families and stories. They had beliefs about the afterlife and were buried with sacred rituals. European attitudes shifted dramatically. Those same social circles that once hosted mummy-tasting parties now considered the practice barbaric. Museums started collecting and preserving mummies as artifacts of a great civilization instead of grinding them up for consumption. By the late 1800s, eating mummies had gone from high-class medicine to something people pretended they'd never been involved with, a shameful secret from a less enlightened time. The tragic part is that by the time Europe developed this conscience, countless mummies had already been destroyed. We're talking about an entire chunk of human history ground up and consumed because of a centuries-long medical fad. Some estimates suggest that the Europeans went through hundreds of thousands of mummies during this period. It's a sobering reminder of how easily curiosity can turn into exploitation and how a lack of understanding can lead to catastrophic loss. This weird chapter in European history left us with more than just some seriously disturbed archaeologists. For starters, it completely changed how we approach ancient artifacts. These days, museums have strict rules about handling human remains. And yes, don't eat them is definitely on that list. The whole mummy-eating episode is a perfect example of what happens when we treat ancient cultures as curiosities to be consumed, rather than as actual civilizations with their own dignity and beliefs. It also shows us how easily common knowledge can be dead wrong. For centuries, the brightest minds in Europe, kings, physicians, philosophers, swore by mummy medicine. The next time someone tells you everybody knows something, remember that everybody once knew that eating mummies was good for your health. It's easy to look back and think, wow, those people were crazy. But remember, they weren't monsters. They were just people trying to solve problems with the knowledge they had. Sure, that knowledge was completely wrong, but they genuinely believed mummy medicine could save lives, sometimes literally betting their lives on it. The real lesson here isn't just, don't eat mummies, though seriously, don't eat mummies. It's about how even the smartest people can believe some pretty wild things when those beliefs get wrapped up in tradition and authority. The final reflection on this bizarre tale is a powerful one. It serves as a stark warning against the dangers of blind faith and the hubris of a culture that believes itself to be superior. The Europeans of the Renaissance and Enlightenment were in a period of unprecedented intellectual growth, yet they fell victim to a medical practice rooted in a single, simple error of translation. Their drive for scientific discovery was often overshadowed by a desperate need for a cure, leading them down a path of grotesque superstition. This contrast between their genuine intellectual curiosity and their barbaric practices is a fascinating paradox of the human condition. The story also speaks to the inherent human desire for a quick fix, a miracle cure. In a world where medicine was often crude and ineffective, a remedy that promised immortality or a cure-all was incredibly seductive. The fact that it came from the mysterious and revered land of ancient Egypt only added to its allure. It was the ultimate exotic medicine, a symbol of power and privilege. The rich could afford to consume a piece of history, believing it would grant them the same long life and power of the pharaohs. The poor, in turn, were sold a cheap, fraudulent version, a cruel irony that highlights the social inequities of the time. Ultimately, the mummy-eating fad reveals a profound lack of respect for other cultures. The ancient Egyptians meticulously preserved their dead for a spiritual purpose, to ensure their journey to the afterlife. The Europeans, however, saw these mummies not as sacred individuals, but as raw material, a resource to be plundered and consumed. This attitude of cultural appropriation and desecration is a pattern that has repeated throughout history, and this story stands as one of the most vivid and unsettling examples. In the end, the story of mummy medicine is not just about a bizarre historical practice. It is a lesson in humility, a cautionary tale for all of us. Next time you're sick and reach for whatever trendy new supplement is making the rounds on social media, perhaps spare a thought for those Europeans and their mummy medicine. After all, at least your miracle cure isn't made from ancient human remains. The story serves as a reminder that we are all products of our time, limited by the knowledge and beliefs of our era. It's a call to question authority, to seek evidence and to approach the unknown with respect rather than a desire to conquer and consume. The tragic fate of thousands of mummies is a permanent scar on the history of medicine and archaeology, a testament to the price of ignorance and superstition. And so, we close this chapter with a final thought. The most powerful medicine is not found in the relics of the past, but in the continuous pursuit of truth and understanding. The human body is a marvel, and its secrets are best unlocked through careful study, not through the consumption of the long dead.